They said she belonged in the hangar, not the cockpit. Said her hands were meant for wrenches, not flight controls. But when the worst storm in 20 years hit the mountains and every qualified pilot was grounded or missing, Elena Martinez was the only person left who knew how to fly. What happened next in those frozen peaks changed everything anyone thought they knew about who belongs behind the controls of a rescue helicopter. If you've ever been told to stay in your lane, that you're not qualified for something bigger, this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button because sometimes the person fixing the machine is the only one who truly understands how to make it soar. Elena Martinez had grease under her fingernails and helicopter fuel in her veins. For 3 years she'd been the lead mechanic at Mountain View Rescue Station, tucked away in the Colorado Rockies where winter storms could turn deadly in minutes and rescue helicopters were often the only thing standing between life and death. While the pilots grabbed coffee and planned their routes, Elena was already in the hangar at 5 a.m., running diagnostics on the Bell 412 helicopters that would carry them into danger. She knew every bolt, every wire, every sound each engine made when it was running perfectly and every different sound it made when something was about to go wrong. The pilots respected her work. They trusted her completely with their lives actually because when Elena signed off on an aircraft, they knew it would bring them home. But they never thought of her as anything more than support crew. Talented support crew sure, but support nonetheless. What they didn't know was that Elena had been a pilot before she was a mechanic. 5 years earlier she'd completed helicopter flight training with the Coast Guard, ranked third in her class, qualified on multiple aircraft types. She'd been weeks away from her first rescue assignment when a training accident, a mechanical failure that wasn't her fault, had resulted in a hard landing that injured her instructor and grounded her indefinitely. The investigation cleared her of any wrongdoing, but the psychological evaluation didn't. Too cautious, they said. Hesitant to make split-second decisions under pressure. Better suited for technical support roles where she could take her time and think things through. So Elena had rebuilt her career from the ground up, literally. She became a mechanic because if she couldn't fly the machines, she could at least keep them flying. And she was brilliant at it. She had an intuitive understanding of how helicopters worked that amazed even veteran mechanics. She could diagnose problems that stumped everyone else, fix complex issues that should have required weeks in the shop. But she never stopped flying. Late at night, when the station was quiet and everyone else had gone home, Elena would sit in the cockpit of whichever helicopter she'd been working on and run through emergency procedures. She'd close her eyes and visualize complex rescue scenarios, talking herself through each step, each decision, each potential complication. The other mechanics thought she was just double-checking her work. The pilots never knew she was there at all. December 15th started like any other winter day at Mountain View. Cold, clear, with weather reports calling for light snow in the afternoon. Elena was in the hangar before dawn, performing routine maintenance on Helicopter 72 Alpha, when Chief Pilot Marcus Webb walked in with his coffee and his flight roster. "Morning, Elena. How's she looking today?" Elena wiped her hands on a rag and gestured toward the aircraft. "She's perfect. Changed the oil, checked the hydraulics, calibrated the navigation systems. Everything's green." Webb nodded. "Good. We've got a busy day. Search and rescue training exercise up on Pike Ridge, then a medical transport from the Valley Hospital." Elena watched as the pilots gathered for their morning briefing. Captain Torres, Lieutenant Kim, Sergeant Washington, and pilot trainee Collins. 4 qualified pilots for 3 available helicopters. Standard operating procedure for a routine day. By 10 a.m. the weather had changed. The light snow had become heavy snow, then driving snow, then something approaching a full blizzard. The training exercise was canceled, but the medical transport couldn't wait. A heart attack victim at the remote Valley Hospital needed immediate evacuation to Denver General. Captain Torres took the call. Elena watched from the hangar as 72 Alpha lifted off into increasingly violent weather. She'd done everything she could to make sure the aircraft was ready. Now all she could do was monitor the radio and hope the storm didn't get worse. It got worse. 2 hours later, Torres's voice crackled through the communications system, tight with stress and barely audible through the static. "Mountain View Base, this is 72 Alpha. We're experiencing severe icing conditions. Instruments are unreliable. We're going to attempt an emergency landing at the Valley Hospital and wait out the storm." Elena grabbed the radio. 72 Alpha, this is base. What's your patient's status?" "Critical. We need to get him to Denver within the hour or we're going to lose him." Elena looked out at the storm raging beyond the hangar doors. Visibility was near zero. Wind gusts were hitting 60 miles per hour. The temperature had dropped to -15 degrees. No helicopter should be flying in these conditions. But someone was going to die if they didn't. Chief Webb was pacing behind the radio operator, his face grim. What do we have available for immediate deployment? The answer was devastating. Lieutenant Kim was sick with the flu. Sergeant Washington was 3 hours away on another call. Trainee Collins wasn't qualified for weather like this. Every other pilot was either off duty or unavailable. Sir, the radio operator said quietly, we have 72 Bravo fueled and ready. But no qualified pilots available. Webb stared at the weather display showing wind speeds and visibility that were beyond safe flying limits. Elena stood quietly in the background, watching, thinking, calculating. Elena, Webb said suddenly, you know these birds better than anyone. What are the chances 72 Alpha can make it through this storm? Elena looked at the weather data, thought about Torres's report of icing conditions, considered the helicopter's capabilities and limitations. Honestly, sir? Not good. The icing is the real problem. If the instruments are unreliable and visibility is zero, even Torres is going to have trouble. And that's assuming the situation doesn't get worse. Can we get another pilot here from Denver? Not in time. The storm's moving east. Denver's already socked in too. Webb was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Elena directly. You have helicopter training. It wasn't a question. Elena had never hidden her background, but she'd never advertised it either. Yes, sir. But that was 5 years ago, and I was grounded for good reason. What reason? Elena hesitated. They said I was too cautious. That I overthought situations instead of relying on instinct. Webb almost smiled. Elena, right now I need someone who overthinks situations. Instinct isn't going to get a helicopter through a blizzard. Careful planning and attention to detail might. Elena felt her heart racing. Everything she'd been preparing for in those late-night sessions, every scenario she'd practiced, every procedure she'd memorized, it had all been leading to this moment. Sir, I haven't been cleared for rescue operations. I'm not current on emergency protocols. I haven't flown in storm conditions like this. But you know these helicopters better than anyone on this base. You know 72 Bravo's quirks, her capabilities, her limitations. You know exactly how she'll handle in bad weather because you've worked on her systems for 3 years. Elena looked out at the storm, then at the radio where Torres's increasingly desperate updates were coming through. The patient was deteriorating. Time was running out. What's your call, Elena? Elena didn't hesitate anymore. I can do it, sir. But I need 15 minutes to prep the aircraft and review the flight path. Webb nodded. You've got it. I'll coordinate with Torres and Denver General. Elena ran to 72 Bravo, her mind already shifting into flight mode. She performed the most thorough pre-flight inspection of her career, checking every system twice, testing every instrument, verifying every backup system. This helicopter wasn't just going to carry her into the storm, it was going to carry her back with a patient whose life depended on everything working perfectly. As she strapped into the pilot's seat, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in 5 years. Not fear, not doubt, but clarity. This was what she'd been preparing for. This was why she'd spent those nights practicing, why she'd memorized every detail of these machines, why she'd never given up on the idea that someday she might fly again. The helicopter lifted off into the storm like a leaf in a hurricane. Immediately, Elena understood why Torres had been struggling. The wind was vicious, trying to grab the aircraft and throw it sideways into the mountains. Ice was forming on the windscreen faster than the de-icing system could clear it. The instruments were fluctuating wildly as electrical systems struggled against the cold. But Elena had expected all of this. She'd studied weather flying for years, read every manual, absorbed every lesson learned from pilots who'd survived similar conditions. More importantly, she knew exactly how 72 Bravo would respond to each challenge. When the wind tried to push her off course, she compensated with subtle control inputs that worked with the helicopter's natural tendencies instead of fighting against them. When ice formed on the rotor blades, threatening to upset the aircraft's balance, she adjusted her flight profile to minimize accumulation. When the instruments became unreliable, she flew by feel, trusting her understanding of the machine's behavior. 30 minutes later, she touched down at the Valley Hospital in conditions that should have been impossible. Torres and his crew were waiting with the patient, their faces showing amazement that anyone had made it through the storm. Elena? What the hell are you doing here? Taking you home, she said simply. Loading the patient took precious minutes. Every second they stayed on the ground, the storm was getting worse. But Elena used the time to inspect 72 Alpha, checking for damage, assessing whether Torres's helicopter could make the return trip. What she found wasn't good. Ice damage to the rotor system, electrical problems from moisture infiltration, and stress fractures in the tail boom that could fail catastrophically if the aircraft encountered more severe turbulence. Torres, your bird's not safe to fly. Transfer your crew to Bravo and we'll all go back together. Elena, that's overloading the aircraft. With 7 people plus medical equipment, we'll be over max gross weight. Elena had already calculated the numbers. We'll be close, but within limits if I adjust the fuel load and flight profile. This helicopter can handle it. In this weather? Elena, no offense, but you haven't flown rescue operations before. Elena looked at him calmly. I've been preparing for this flight for 5 years. Trust me. The return trip was even more challenging. The additional weight made the helicopter sluggish, less responsive to control inputs. The storm had intensified, with wind gusts now exceeding 70 miles per hour. Ice was forming faster than the systems could handle it. But Elena flew with a precision that amazed even Torres. Every movement was calculated, every decision based on deep understanding of the aircraft's capabilities. She found wind currents that other pilots wouldn't have known existed, used terrain features to shield the helicopter from the worst gusts, managed power settings with surgical precision to maintain performance despite the overweight condition. Halfway back, the navigation systems failed completely. They were flying blind in a blizzard, with no visual references and no electronic guidance. Most pilots would have been forced to attempt an emergency landing and wait out the storm. Elena kept flying. She navigated by timing and dead reckoning, using her knowledge of the terrain and the helicopter's performance to plot a course back to base. She'd memorized every landmark, every safe landing zone, every obstacle between the hospital and home. When they finally broke through the clouds and saw the lights of Mountain View Base ahead, Torres keyed the intercom. Elena, that was the finest piece of flying I've ever seen. Where did you learn to do that? Elena smiled as she brought the helicopter in for a perfect landing despite wind conditions that were testing the limits of what was physically possible. 3 years of fixing these birds taught me how they really fly. 5 years of wondering if I'd ever get another chance taught me to be ready when the opportunity came. The patient was transferred to the waiting ambulance and rushed to Denver General. He survived, made a full recovery, and sent Elena a letter months later thanking her for saving his life. But Elena never read it as a personal triumph. She read it as validation that preparation, patience, and refusing to accept other people's limitations as your own could make the difference between life and death. Chief Webb found her in the hangar the next morning, performing routine maintenance on 72 Bravo just as she had every morning for 3 years. Elena, I've been thinking about your status here. How would you feel about getting back on flight status? We could use someone with your skills and judgment. Elena looked up from the engine she was inspecting. I'd like that, sir. But I want to keep working on the mechanical side too. Flying these birds taught me something yesterday. The better you understand the machine, the better you can make it perform when it matters most. 6 months later, Elena was certified as both a rescue pilot and lead mechanic at Mountain View. She flew dangerous missions that other pilots couldn't handle and maintained aircraft to standards that exceeded anything the base had ever seen. But she still spent evenings in the hangar working on helicopters and thinking about worst-case scenarios. Because she'd learned that being ready for the impossible was just part of doing the job right. New pilots who came to Mountain View would sometimes ask how Elena had become so skilled so quickly. The veterans would tell them the truth: she hadn't become skilled quickly. She'd been preparing quietly for years, perfecting her craft in silence, waiting for the moment when her skills would be needed most. Because that's what real professionals do. They don't wait for permission to be excellent. They don't let other people's doubts become their limitations. They prepare thoroughly, serve faithfully, and step forward when lives depend on someone being ready for the impossible. Elena Martinez proved that sometimes the person everyone overlooks is exactly the person everyone needs. The mechanic who understands machines better than anyone. The grounded pilot who never stopped learning to fly. The careful thinker in a world that values quick reactions. Sometimes what looks like a limitation is actually your greatest strength. Sometimes being told you can't do something is just the universe's way of making sure you're ready when you finally can. If this story inspired you, hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who needs to hear that their time is coming. Because the world needs more people who prepare in silence and deliver when it matters most. What do you think? Who in your life has surprised everyone by being ready for their moment? Share their story in the comments below.